I think in many ways I've spent my career, trying to take, some of those stories and present them in a museum environment. There's really a large heritage investment that's been made in heritage tourism, historic preservation here over the last couple decades. And just in the city, we've developed several museums. The National Park Service has a big presence here. And then I would like to think that with the Johnstown Flood Museum that we render that story in some measure with immediacy. We have an audio tape, an interview with Dr. Victor Heiser in New York City in the 1960s. And Heiser was a very old man, but he had a really keen memory, and it's one of the most amazing pieces of oral history I've ever heard. And likewise, there's a huge body of literature there of testimony, written accounts of the flood.
I came here 10 years ago because we have a story to tell here in Johnstown. The flood is just one of the nationally significant stories. But we, I think, are telling this so well. This community can be very proud of this facility and this whole commemoration.
What that did was put that out onto a national stage for a whole new generation of Americans. And I think here in Johnstown, again, there was some mixed feelings about whether or not that story should be remembered. This was something that was part of American folklore and popular culture at one point. The Johnstown flood was just beginning to drop from popular culture. You'd had the 75th anniversary, and the survivors of the Johnstown flood were, now very much up in years.
My father ran in, he said, "Get out as fast as you can, come on." And he said, "The dam is broke."
Elsie Frum, who was 6 at the time, fled into the hills surrounding the city with her family.
And that's about the time, traditionally, when you begin to commemorate a story or you just lose it. It's been said that every generation writes its own history. It's interesting that I've been working with this story for decades, and we know much more about the geography and hydraulics of the flood. I think we know more about the dam. There's a lot of environmental history that is looked at the Johnstown flood. But these are all, I think, small stories. They're important. They help our understanding of the event. What was significant and maybe even overlooked about Johnstown, Johnstown was at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution and the era of cheap steel, and it was a very dynamic community in that period. The population was doubling every decade, and the Cambria Iron Company was at that point a leader in the emerging American steel industry. And a lot of the new technology that revolutionized steelmaking came out of Johnstown, and really that was the first that I knew about this. There was a period there in the mid-90s when after the Bethlehem plant had been sold, and some of the oldest buildings, the lower works, were threatened with demolition. In fact, some of them were demolished, and several of them have been reused. We're still working to develop a blacksmith shop, but in many ways, arguably, they're the most important sites in Johnstown's history. And I think David McCullough's book on the Johnstown flood was really the beginning of a popular reappraisal of Johnstown's history. Johnstown, I think, really wanted to put its heritage behind it. to get rid of that. Johnstown was known as Flood City for many years, and much of the business leadership wanted to get rid of that image, and somehow we'd be better off without our heritage. You can't. You can't shake your heritage. It's part of who you are, and it's part of the character of your community. But you can use it to create a strong sense of place that I think successful communities do. I think that's what makes Johnstown so interesting. Or the stories that are attached to it, the geography, the buildings. There's no place looks quite like Johnstown.